If someone who knows you were to walk up to you and say these words, "You are amazing," how would that make you feel? And I'm not talking about, some kind of like flippant words or, hey, I'm just off the cuff saying this, I'm talking about somebody walks up to you and in the most meaningful way, they look at you and they just say, "I just want you to know you are so amazing." How would that make you feel? I bet it would kind of light you up on the inside. I bet it would give you strength and put some wind in your sails. Or imagine this. Imagine if your husband, he came up to you and he had this water in his eyes, this liquid that's called tears. Guys have a hard time talking about that, And he looks at you, but I'm talking about in one of the most connective, meaningful ways. Like he is captivated by you. And he says these words to you. "You are so beautiful. You're so beautiful. You're my best friend. I love you." What would that do to you as a wife? Just those words. Wouldn't that just bring this sense of warmth and security and cause you to want to move in his direction? Or how about this? What if someone that knew you came up to you and they said these words, "I see you." That'd be weird, wouldn't it? You'd be like, "That's odd. Who are you?" You'd be like, "That's not even from this planet." And you would be right, because that's actually from the planet Pandora in the movie Avatar. And they actually say this throughout the movie, and they're like, these are words that are super meaningful on this planet for one another. Say, "Hey, I'm here for you." In fact, sometimes I'll walk around our office, and I'll walk up to a staff member, and I'll look at them, and I'll go, "I see you." They're like, "You're so weird, Buck." And I'm like, "I know." Anyways, my point is this, is that, guys, when it comes to words are extraordinarily influential, and words are powerful. I mean, this is why when I sit down with guys that are, maybe in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it really doesn't matter. When I sit down with guys and I get to hear their stories and they tell me about their family, inevitably somewhere along the lines, they say something like, "Man, Buck, I so long to hear my dad say these 4 words, 'Son, I love you,' or to say these 7 words, 'Son, I'm so proud of you.'" In fact, just this last week, I heard a story of a man who sat with his father who was passing away, and he literally heard his father's last heartbeat. And right after he heard his dad's last heartbeat, his very first thought is, "I wonder if this man ever loved me. I wonder if my dad ever loved me." Can you imagine that? Because I'm just telling you, when I sit down with 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old men, it really doesn't matter. And they begin to talk about their dad, and they talk about that moment, when they were 24 or 32 or 43, that they heard these words, "Son, I love you," or "Son, I'm so proud of you." I mean, they share their story with all this emotion and passion, and just say, "Man, that was a pivotal moment. That was a moment that put wind in my sails, and man, I had such strength as a man." And my point, guys, is words, they're extraordinarily powerful. And perhaps there's no other environment, no other relational context that they have power like they do in a family. In fact, based on all the research that I've read and all the things I've seen and all personal experiences, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think there's a more powerful force to shape the direction and quality of your family than our words. I love what Rabbi Berg, who's the late rabbi, very famous rabbi in America, what he had to say about words. He said this. He said, words are singularly the most powerful force available to humanity. We can choose to use this force constructively with words of encouragement or destructively using words of despair. He goes on and he says, words have energy and power with the ability to help, to heal, to hinder, to hurt, to harm, to humiliate, and to humble. That your words can shape the direction and quality of your family. That your words can influence your marriage one way or the other. That your words can such lay a foundation for your sons and daughters to shape their identity and their self-worth. I mean, words are incredibly powerful, and words have the ability to lead to a place or be a catalyst for happiness and joy and peace in our family. In fact, a very famous psychologist by the name of Dr. Gottman, he's got this study that he did with his colleague called the magic relationship ratio. And here's part of their research. Here's what he discovered in his research. He said, to understand the difference between happy and unhappy couples, Dr. Gottman and Robert Levinson began doing a longitudinal studies of couples. And it continues. Their discovery was simple. The difference between happy and unhappy couples is the balance between positive and negative interactions. There's a very specific ratio that makes love last. And here's what it is. That magic ratio is 5-1. This means that for every negative interaction during conflict, a stable and happy marriage has 5 or more positive interactions. If the positive to negative ratio during conflict is 1-1 or less, that's unhealthy and indicates a couple teetering on the edge of divorce. Now, what's fascinating about this research is Dr. Gottman and Levinson, both of them said with 90% accuracy, I mean, that's a heck of a study. 90% accuracy, they could predict whether or not this couple will last or this couple will be divorced based upon the words that they shared, positive to negative. That stable, happy couples have far more positive interactions than negative. And I would go so far to say stable, happy, secure, content families, the place of joy, have far more positive than negative interactions. So guys, if the most powerful force to determine the direction and quality of our family are the words we choose to use, and if our family, the contentment and the peace and the joy and the happiness, what we all long for, is so determined by how we allocate and use our words, either positive or negative, then as we move into part 2 of this series called Family Filters, we've got to talk about words, because they're extraordinarily powerful. Now, if you weren't here last week when we kicked this whole series off, I gotta let you know, this whole series is for all of us. It really is. It really doesn't matter if you're, husband, a wife, son, daughter, sibling, brother and sister. It doesn't matter if you've been married once or 10 times. It doesn't matter if you have, 2 kids or 20 kids. I mean, at the end of the day, it's for every single family dynamic what we're talking about. And if you're a Christian or not a Christian, a God follower, not a God follower, what we're talking about in this series is how can every single one of us take one step, then perhaps 2 steps towards what we all long for and desire in that ideal, safe, secure, joyful family. That's what we're talking about. And as we talk about how to take some practical steps, guys, we have to talk about words. Now, as we're in this family series, what's really cool is today I want to hear from somebody in Jesus' family. In fact, the person I want to hear from is actually Jesus' brother. His name is James. And I wish we had a lot of time just to kind of hang out and explore and talk about James because he's got such a fascinating story. In fact, we could talk about this several weeks and just all the details, but just to give you a little bit of a snapshot about James, the cool thing about James is if we didn't have the Bible today, say the Bible didn't exist, we would know James lived in the 1st century. We would know James is the brother of Jesus, and we would know how James died. We would know all that information from a Jewish historian outside the context of the Bible. And when it comes to the story of James, what's really cool is from all biblical accounts, James thought his brother Jesus was a lunatic. He really did. He thought his brother was crazy. Like when he thought about his brother, he would go like, I don't know, he claims to be the Son of God. He claims to be the Messiah. But for me, I think he's crazy, right? That was James. I mean, that all 3 years of Jesus' ministry until the day came where Jesus was arrested. He was brought outside the city of Jerusalem to a place called Golgotha, which literally means the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified. And James looked at his mom, Mary, looking at his brother, who he thinks is crazy, next to a man named John, who he equally thinks is crazy because John was the best friend of Jesus. And he sees him die. And John understood enough context about Roman crucifixions that everybody hung on a Roman cross dies. He knew that. His brother was dead. But then 3 days later, James had breakfast with his brother Jesus on the beach. And he went, okay, I guess I was wrong. And he began to call Jesus his Lord and his Savior and his God. Well, according to context and historians outside the Bible, time passes and James becomes one of the first century leaders in the first century church. And eventually James was arrested by the Jewish high priest Annas. Annas takes him and says, brings him before kind of the court of the day, if you will. And he was accused of blasphemy because he kept saying his brother rose from the dead, that his brother Jesus is the Messiah. He kept telling everybody that. And so they arrested him saying, you're a heretic. And they took him to the Jewish temple. They threw him off the Jewish temple. When he landed, he didn't die. Then Jewish leaders surrounded him, took stones, and finished him off and stoned him to death. And he died not because of a philosophy or a belief system. James died because he said, my brother rose from the dead. I think you've got to consider that when thinking about what took place in history. Well, James, so cool. We actually have a letter from James, and he gives us so much insight into life. And James gives us insight into words and how powerful words are, and he gives us a tool that, again, will work for every single one of us if you're a God follower or not. And here's what he says is a step we can all take when it comes to our words. He starts this way. He says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. And that's important because James is like writing and he's like, oh, okay, come on, pay attention. Yeah, put all your devices down and pick the ones up you take notes with. He's like, this is that important. This is for everyone. And I love he says that. Take note of this. Take note of what, James? He goes, when it comes to your words, here's what you need to think about. Everyone should be quick to listen. In other words, your number one priority in every single one of your relationships is to be quick to listen. Quick to listen. Now, James is writing this in the Greek, and in the Greek, if you were to kind of put this in an application form and say, what does that mean practically for you and I today? James is saying your number one priority in every single one of your relationships is to be curious. Be curious. Like when your wife says that, be curious about why she says that. Be curious about your relationship with your wife. Be curious about your husband when he does that, or when he says he believes that, or he thinks that thing. Just be curious about it. When it comes to your son or daughter, be curious about him. Be curious about them. When it comes to your mom and dad, hey, they said that, did that. Be curious. And this is really, really important because oftentimes in a family relationship, any family dynamic or relationship, we will find ourselves saying things like this. We're going to find ourselves going, man, I don't understand why she said that. I don't understand why he did that. I don't understand why they believe that. That's crazy. They're off the rocker, And here's the deal. From this moment forward, so we're all together in this, right? From this moment forward, anytime you find yourself saying in your head or out loud, I don't understand why you said this, believed this, did this. The problem's not on them. It's on you. You self-admittedly said, I don't understand. James says, be curious. Just say, hey, tell me more about that. Hey, I'd love to hear more. Ask questions. Be curious with every single one of your relationships. That's your priority. My counselor would remind me of this all the time. I remember, I'd talk with my counselor and I'd talk about either the boys or Jill or, a friend of mine or whatever it is. And I would share here's the context, here's what's going on. And I just don't understand why they would do that or say that. And my counselor would say this all the time. She would say, Buck, just because they don't say it the way you want them to say it, or just because they don't say it the way how you want them to say it, doesn't mean they're not saying something. Your job as a husband, your job as a father, your job as a friend and a pastor is to discover what they're saying. So be curious. Ask questions. James, in his brilliance, says to every single one of us when it comes to our words, first and foremost, be curious, be quick to listen, quick to listen. And then he continues, and he says, not only that, everyone should be quick to listen, but slow to speak. Now, again, he's writing this in the Greek, and if we were to take this in the Greek and kind of extrapolate and put it in today's application, like what does this mean? He's basically saying, hey, wait and be late. When it comes to your words, wait and be late with your words. Now, this doesn't mean for you and I to act like the guy on Duck Dynasty, Mountain Man. I don't know if you guys have seen that. You guys know Mountain Man? He's like, hello. He's just slow with his words. And you're like, that's not what James is getting at. He's talking more like Yoda. You know Yoda on Star Wars? Where Yoda's like, man, he asks like one or two questions. He's very curious, doesn't really respond, and then gives you like 4 words, and you're like, brilliant. I mean, that was so good. This is what James is getting at. He's like, hey, be like Yoda. That's what I'm getting at. And if you've ever been on the other side of somebody who's like Yoda and provides Yoda moments in your life, I mean, for me, it drives me bonkers. In fact, I have a mentor I was talking with a few months ago, and I was just sharing something between Jill and I that was going on and giving details, and here's what's going on, and it's frustrating and all this kind of stuff. And I got done, and I was on the phone, so it was about 10 minutes. I was just talking and talking and talking. You guys know I like talking. So I'm talking. And at the end, silence. And I'm thinking to myself, did we get cut off? You know, what's going on? Did I say something mean? You know, does he still like that? I mean, what's going on? My insecurities start boiling up, and I start feeling them and all this. And finally I said, are you there? Are you there? And the individual said, yeah, I'm here, Buck. And I heard what you said, and I'm curious about a couple things, and I'm not sure how to respond to you. So I'm actually inviting the Lord into this so I can know what to say to you. And in that moment, I went, that's a Yoda moment, right there. I mean, that my mentor took what Paul said and actually was doing it in his life. Paul says this. Paul says these words, we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. In other words, when you have that thought and it comes your way, right, and it's inside of you, it's the idea to go, hey, I'm going to just take that to Jesus. I'm going to kind of punt it to Jesus. I'm going to turn it over to Jesus. I'm going to go, okay, here's what I'm thinking about my wife, my husband, my son, my daughter, whoever it may be in my family. Jesus, here it is. I'm going to submit it to you. What would you say to do with this thought? How would you handle this thought? Jesus, what would love require of me to do with this thought? And Paul goes on to say the outcome of doing that, putting it before Jesus, making it obedient to Jesus, the outcome is don't speak until you can get to this place. To not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. I love that Paul tagged this last little bit on this verse. Because this is the idea that, when I'm behind closed doors, I can say a lot of things that are pretty unfiltered. But when I go in my front yard and I see something my boys have done, left out, something I told them not to leave out, my tools or whatever it is, and all of a sudden I walk out and I look to my left and my right and there's my neighbors. There's a new filter. I got to watch my words. I got to be careful with what my words, because people are listening. Is it going to benefit them? Paul says to you and to me, submit it to Jesus Christ. Punt it. Get it over to him. And he will be faithful to your thoughts. And he will let you know what love requires of you. And ultimately, the outcome of that, it's going to be wholesome. It's going to be beneficial to build them up according to their needs so it may benefit those that are listening. Now, this doesn't mean roses and, ice cream and just no hard words. I mean, sometimes the most beneficial thing is to say something that is hard to hear. But have you been curious? Have you asked the questions? Have you captured your thoughts and submitted them to Christ? And if you thought about the words you're going to say, if they were public, would you say those words? See, James is saying to you and to me, very practically speaking, saying, hey, when it comes to your words, when it comes to your family, man, be quick to listen, and slow to speak. And then look at what he says next. I love this. He continues. And he says, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, this concept of anger right here, here's what it means. It's this idea of drawing hasty, misinformed, relationally destructive conclusions. In other words, if you were to ask me, how do we practically do this? How do we slow our anger? Like, how do we get to that point? Practically speaking, in our marriages and in our families, how do we get there? then I would use this phrase. I would say something maybe you've heard, slow your roll. Just slow your roll. You know, in the Urban Dictionary, if you've ever read that, I mean, it's like, you know, this means like, hey, just chill out a bit. Hey, before you get too worked up, just slow your roll. Because here's what I know. I guarantee it, because we're all human beings. Your husband is going to say something that's going to be hurtful. Your wife is going to say something that's going to fire you up. Your kids are going to do things that are going to get you all agitated, and I can't believe, and don't they know, and man, didn't they hear me? I mean, your mom and dad are going to say things they shouldn't be saying. Your family, you're going to feel anger. And James knew this, and so he gave us some insight, and he just said, hey, slow your roll. Slow your roll when it comes to your anger. So what does this look like for you and I, practically speaking? Looks like to be a responder, not a reactor. You know, a reactor is somebody who kind of reverses what James is teaching us. A reactor walks into, you know, the family, or the reactor walks into that marriage, or the reactor walks in the son or daughter, or the reactor, and they're quick to anger, and they are fast to speak, and they do not want to understand you. They want you to understand them. And man, if you're a reactor, and that is your MO, and that's kind of what people know about you, you just walk in and you're quick with your words. I mean, I'll tell you what's going on. I'll tell you how this is all going. I'll tell you what's happening here. You know it. That's dividing. That creates gaps in your family. That creates questions with your sons and daughters in terms of their value and identity. Don't be a reactor. Be a responder. A responder, somebody walks in and yeah, they're real, they're human. I feel it, that was hurtful. You know, but I'm going to take 5 minutes. I mean, my daughter said this and wow, that's hurtful, and I want to react. I'm going to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I'm just going to go in the living room. I'm going to bring this before the Lord. I'm going to take 3 giant deep breaths. And then I'm going to re-engage in that conversation. But I got to slow my roll when it comes to my anger. Guys, I've experienced this so much. I mean, if you've come to Northpoint a while, I've shared with you. I mean, my tendency is to react. I want to react. You know, my mind goes quick, and I want to go, oh, here's all the conclusions, and here's what's actually going on. Man, I've done so much damage in my family. I have so many regrets as a result. In fact, a couple months ago, there's a great example of this. I had gotten a new car to me, because if you've come to Northpoint for a while, I shared the story when my car got totaled by hail, and so then I bought a new car to me as a used car. And so anytime you buy a new car, like you want it to look like, you know, fancy, or you want it to look like clean, because that's the cleanest it'll ever be at that moment. And so it was in my garage, and it was all cleaned up, and I remember walking out in my garage, and I look at my car as I walk out in the garage, and my windshield, my driver's side, my back, you know, all the windows were full of grease. And I'm looking at it going like, this is crazy. They're all full of, what happened? And the grease is kind of dripping down the side of my car, all these streaks. You can't see in, you can't see out. And I look behind the car, and I see a chamois. And if you don't know what a chamois is, it's what you use to kind of dry your cars, like leather stuff. They're a little bit expensive. And I saw a chamois, and you got to keep that sealed. It wasn't sealed. It was sitting out in the driveway, and it was baked by the sun. It was toast. And I'm sitting there walking out in the garage, seeing this with my new car, and I'm like, are you kidding me? What's going on here? And I'm thinking, one of my boys? I mean, I've told him 100 times not to jack with my stuff, you know? And I was hot. I was angry. So in that moment, and I don't always get this right, in that moment I walk back in. A couple of my boys are in the living room. I go into my room, my sink in my room, and I splash some cold water because I needed it. And about 10 minutes later, I walked out, and I walk in the living room. I said, hey, boys, you see what's going on in the garage with my car? And my 12-year-old son, Jonathan, has a huge smile on his face. And he's like, yeah, Dad, look at me. Yeah, I did it. He's like, I wanted to surprise you and wash all your windows. Well, the problem was, on the shelf in our garage, there's the tire shine that you shine your tires and oil your tires, and the window cleaner next to one another. They look similar. And logically speaking, my son, you know, Jonathan, says this thing dries the car, so I should get this out. You know, he left it out. Hey, no harm, no foul at the end of the day. Now, if I would have come in all hot and bothered, as I've done so many times before, I could have crushed him. I could have crushed him in that moment that he wanted to celebrate something valuable to me. James knew this. James knew the power of your words and my words. So James says, when it comes to your anger, slow your roll. Slow your roll. Be curious. Take your thoughts captive. Be a responder. Take that 5 minutes, extra 5 minutes, 10 minutes to get to a place you can have a conversation. And then James concludes with this. He knows how powerful anger is. He says, because our anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. I love he says this because it indicates to you and I, God desires good things for your family. He really does. He desires it to be a place of peace, a place of rest. I mean, goodness, we got enough stress going to work, going to school, dealing with friends, dealing with extended family. I mean, we got to, feels like sometimes you got to perform beyond. You want to come home and you want to just let some rest and air come into your lungs and just be you. We desire that. God desires that for your home. And God desires a way to move forward with that. But the reality is, maybe you've never been taught this in church, God gives you far more freedom than perhaps, again, you've been taught. And you can leverage your freedom for good, or you can leverage your freedom for bad. But God does not leave you alone. He's given us people like James to give us insight into what to do. I'm telling you, with that freedom, when we use our freedom with our husband, to say, hey, to our husband, those words of disrespect, and you know what buttons to push, you know how to really hurt him, how to discourage him. When you use those words, that's not what God desires. When it comes to your wife and you just treat her like an everyday thing and, hey, she's just here and, it's so unloving. Like she doesn't matter, she doesn't have value, and that's just your MO. I mean, we've been married that's not what God desires. As a son or daughter with your parents, you know those buttons to push. When you say to your mom or your dad the words, I hate you, that goes right to their soul, and that's not what they desire. And as a parent, your words are so influential in the lives of your kiddos. Those words can last for years and years and years and years with your sons and daughters. In fact, I think about, my relationship with my dad. I remember when I was 9 years old. 9 years old, I was playing basketball out in the driveway. I'm just, hanging out, just as a 9-year-old. And I remember out of the corner of my eye, I saw my dad come out of the front door. And I saw him as I've seen him so many times with his eyes just wide open, his face so pointed, and he was angry. And my dad was a reactor. In fact, I can't think of one moment he ever responded. He's a reactor. And he came out and he was blazing. He comes around the corner, I'm looking and I'm all nervous again as his son. And he takes my shirt and he slams me against the garage. And he says, if your mother and I ever get a divorce, it's your fault. That took me 25 years to process. And in those 25 years, the things I swore I would never do to my children, I repeated the sins of my father because I didn't process that. That's the power of words. And James knows this. And James is for you and for me. And so, of course, James says, guys, when it comes to your words, man, there's no more powerful force to determine the direction and quality of your family. So come on. Be quick to listen. Be curious and ask questions. Hey, what's going on with that? Anytime I don't understand, well, that's on you. Be curious. Be slow to speak. Take your thoughts captive. Put them over to Jesus. I promise you, he will answer that. And until you can get to the point to let wholesome conversation or words come out of your mouth that build up, that you would say publicly, don't say it. And be slow to anger. Slow your roll. Slow your roll. Be a responder. Take the extra 10 minutes. Heck, take a day. Take a week. It's your son. It's your daughter. It's your husband. It's your wife. It's your family. Be a responder. So, that's so practical. And that's for everyone, regardless if you're a God follower or not. And that will work. So let me check in with you. Let me just kind of push on you a little bit. How are you guys doing with this? When it comes to your family, when it comes to your marriage, when it comes to your son or daughter, when it comes to your brothers and sisters, when it comes to your mom and dad, your family dynamic, your family relationships, is this kind of describe what's going on? Or let me ask it a different way. Think about this. Think of Dr. Gottman's study, you know, the whole magic relationship ratio, 5-1. What's your family ratio? In your family, if you were to take maybe 24 hours, maybe 3 days, maybe 7 days, and if legit you were like writing this down, being super intentional, said, okay, in my marriage, what's my ratio? Is it positive and negative? How many interactions? How many words do I? You know, with my son, my daughter, what's my ratio? With my mom and dad, what's my ratio? If you were to capture that, what would your ratio be? Would it be 10-1? In other words, you say, man, this is something we do in our family. And it's 10 positive to 1, negative. Hey, we're human. We're going to mess up. Get it? Is it 5-1? 5 positive to 1 negative? Or, if you're honest, is it 1-1? Is it 1-10? 1-5? Guys, I'm telling you, I have taught this stuff before. I know what James says. But this week, I did this in my family. I made some observations of how my boys interact with one another, how Jill and I interact, how we interact with our boys. And I'm telling you, our ratio's not good. It's not good. And I've been up front with you guys many, many times. Sometimes I'll start, a whole service and I'll say, hey, today I'm going to more teach to me and have a conversation with me. Hopefully it's beneficial for you. This is one of those days. As I wrote this and thought about all this stuff, I was like, man, I am talking to me because my ratio's not that great. And if that's you, in the most honest moment, if you're like, Buck, I think that's kind of where I'm at in the most important relationships in my life, then what do we do? How do we move forward? Well, first, you got to know what we talked about last week. You can wake up every day of your life and know that God's mercies are brand new. You're forgiven. God's grace is amazing, as Jamie was singing about. And God's love is big enough to handle our mess-ups and our mistakes. First and foremost, go there. And secondly, James gives us something practical. From this day forward, take a snapshot, whatever you need to do, capture this. Go and read the letter of James and be quick to listen. Be slow to speak and slow to anger. And if we're willing to apply this, because you have freedom to choose to or choose not to, if we're willing to apply this, then imagine what your home would be like. Imagine a 5-1, a 10-1. Imagine that this is what is said in your home over and over, and this is just kind of the fabric of your home. Man, I love you. You are so beautiful. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry. I forgive you. Great job, kiddo. Great job. That's amazing. I'm so proud of you. Wow, look at the way you did that. That would be different than I would, but I'm so proud of you. Thank you. Man, that was thoughtful. Thank you for thinking of me. Great idea. That's different than my idea, but your idea is better. Great idea. You are incredible. Can you imagine if that was the context of your home? If that was the consistency of words in your relationship, in your home? Can you feel and sense how the joy and peace and happiness could be found in that? Guys, for every single one of us, we have a way forward. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this moment that we can have this conversation. God, I know that in my family dynamic right now, this isn't great. And perhaps there are people watching, listening, or here that can relate with that. And so, Father, I just first and foremost want to just embrace your love, embrace the truth that I am forgiven, embrace that your mercies are new every morning, and that today I can start over. And so, Father, I just pray with these words and these teachings from James that you press them upon our hearts, that we can go home from this day forward and never forget this, that you remind us of these things, and then give us the courage, the discipline. It will require that, God. Give me the courage and discipline to do this with my family, and give us the courage to do this with our families. God, I just trust that to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.